All right, let's continue our study of the civil rights movement in Mississippi with a focus on really what's usually known for the movement. 1945-1964 is kind of the peak, and so let's start to look at that. In our first video here, or this is video 4, we're going to look at kind of the early movement, 1945 to 1955, with a focus on Brown versus Board as kind of the main centerpiece. So we start with 1945, really with the end of World War II. And tens of thousands of African Americans fought in World War II, and they definitely did face discrimination in the military. But while in Europe, they were facing for the first time a life without Jim Crow, a life with severely diminished racism. And so somehow it took leaving America to understand American rights. And so these black veterans return from Europe, and they find a country that hasn't changed with them. That a country that is still deeply divided by race, but they had gained new skills, they had gained status as veterans, and confidence as veterans that's going to really help them fight for racial justice. And so they get back home and they want change, and now they're going to start to fight for that change. And so they are now speaking out against racism, challenging the racial hierarchy. And they start to join organizations, clubs that are going to fight against Jim Crow. The NAACP is the most clear example, and their membership rises significantly in this era, from 18,000 in the 1930s, before the war, to 156,000 by the end of the war. So we see a clear jump in the numbers between the beginning and end of this war. And although membership was more concentrated in the less violent and oppressive states, branches started to go out into the South, especially the most violent state, Mississippi, and they started to set clear goals for change. So what's their main strategy? It's the law. It's the court system. That they're not going to go for violent change. They're going to change the legal status and step-by-step work. And so the courts are going to be the main battleground where they're going to fight. And so states, courts, federal government, and citizens all disputed how the 14th and 15th Amendments are going to be interpreted. 14th as in who is a citizen, 15th as in who gets to vote. Example is the Supreme Court's decision of the 14th Amendment in Plessy versus Ferguson that made racial segregation legal. And that's all challenging the 14th and 15th Amendments. What do we do with them? So in 1944, a Supreme Court case, Smith versus Allwright, the court ruled that preventing blacks from voting in state Democratic primary elections was illegal. It's going to take another 20 years to actually enforce this decision, though, and so that's kind of our focus throughout these lectures, is not just changing the law, but enforcing the law. De jure segregation as far as what is legal versus de facto what is. And so this decision inspires black veterans to attempt to vote and help organize voter registration campaigns to actually use their rights now. As a result, more black Southerners are starting to go out to the polls in 1946 than at any point since Reconstruction. So we're getting a shift in the exercise of voting rights. Another major case is Brown versus Board. So in the early 50s, the NAACP wins a series of Supreme Court cases demanding that state governments provide equal educational opportunities regardless of race, because they hadn't been. Following these victories, the NAACP decided, all right, let's just get rid of segregation itself. If we're going to start to go for equality, let's just get rid of this whole Plessy versus Ferguson thing. So several different schools combine their cases into one big case, Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. And so again, it's all these schools combined into kind of one thing because many schools had the same issue of unequal educational priorities here. And so they win. This eliminates Plessy versus Ferguson, and it makes state-sponsored segregation illegal. It's now illegal. Whether or not that's going to be the fact, that's going to be the fight from here on out. And the case focused on public schools, and the court ruled that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Segregation is a denial of equal protection of the laws, so it's got to go. And so it's a win, but there is going to be a fight coming. Even though it's the law, it's not the fact. And so this is a major win, so we see reactions to Brown. So the year later, 1955, black activists, including Rosa Parks, MLK, and members of a women's political council launched a citywide bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama to protest racial segregation in public transportation, because that's supposed to be gone now. It's going to take a while. And so blacks refused to ride the buses for months, really putting economic pressure on the city. They're losing money. That's how you're going to create change, those boycotts, the wallet. In 1956, in one of the first great victories of the movement, the Supreme Court rules, Browder versus Gale, that segregation on buses is also unconstitutional. So they're getting the courts on their side. Now they need to create change amongst white Southerners. And so the black reaction to Brown is great. Hey, let's try it out. And so to test this decision, the NAACP attempted to register black students in white schools as kind of a test case. And so in 1957, 9 black students are chosen to enroll in an all-white school in Little Rock, Arkansas. And these aren't random students. These are families that have NAACP connections and are willing to take the risk, because it is a serious risk to be the first. The Arkansas governor tries to send in his troops. He sends in the National Guard to prevent integration. But then the president sends in the U.S. Army to escort the students. So it's kind of state versus national militaries here. And the military stays, the U.S. Army stays in Arkansas throughout the school year. Or they have soldiers posted outside the classroom escorting these students to and from school. The governor responds by the next year closing all public schools in Little Rock the following year, saying if you're going to mess with my schools, then nobody gets to school. How did white Southerners react to Brown versus Board? Not well. Many Southern whites opposed the decision as an attack on the Southern traditions of segregation and white supremacy. A lot of prominent whites decided to organize white citizens' councils to resist integration. And these councils are going to use economic punishments, do whatever they can to prevent integration, to maintain the racial hierarchy. And so when African Americans or even white moderates wanted to support civil rights activity, wanted to support change, white businessmen that are part of these councils and government leaders that are part of these councils would fire people, take away jobs, deny loans, boycott black businesses, punish them economically however they can. An example. When black parents in Yazoo City, Mississippi signed a desegregation petition, just signing their name on a little piece of paper from the NAACP saying, hey, this is not right. The Citizens Council published the names of everybody that signed that paper, and any bosses that didn't want those employees would fire them. This is an example of integration when it comes to people moving into towns. As far as if a black family was able to really get through all the other gates to get to a white community, the white community would harass and annoy them however possible, playing loud music, etc. How else did they react? A lot of southern state governments took measures to keep segregation, to maintain the old ways. They made voter registration requirements stricter and threatened to shut down public schools just like Arkansas. The newspapers would only publish stories sympathetic to white supremacy, and anything that's about change is somehow evil. Local TV stations pulled the plug on national coverage of any civil rights activity and any other black activism, only showing local white citizens councils in a positive light. 1956, the Mississippi created the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission, kind of a statewide branch of the White Council, a secretive government branch devoted to preventing the enforcement of federal civil rights laws. So it's state versus federal here. They're trying to maintain their old ways. Throughout the mass civil rights movement, this Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission and government branches like it in a lot of other states, Mississippi kind of sets the example, they would spy on civil rights activists and work with the citizens' councils at the local level to prevent civil rights activity. And so they'd put out little pamphlets like this, and they'd organize strikes. And so how did the Brown decision affect black activism? The NAACP decided to drop its desegregation campaign in Mississippi, where white resistance was the most intense. They don't want violence, where they can avoid it. And so if they can fight in other ways and avoid violence, that's going to be the strategy. So the federal government wasn't willing to intervene. The presidents weren't doing that much to really enforce these laws. Because segregation is now illegal, however, they're not doing anything to enforce the federal government's view that it's illegal. Black activists worked to improve the lives of African Americans wherever they could and fight for change at the local level because the federal government's not doing anything to create that change because everybody wanted to avoid that violence. Local chapters would organize voter registration classes, they'd petition schools to integrate, and they'd boycott white businesses hostile to them. But again, trying to avoid violence, they're trying to do it as peacefully as possible. They also start to develop youth councils to organize leadership for the future. 1954, Medgar Evers, the NAACP hires Medgar Evers here as the Mississippi field director to kind of really try to organize Mississippi. Emmett Till, and this is kind of a flashpoint, a major shift in the movement. 1955, two white men in Mississippi murdered a 14-year-old black boy visiting from Chicago named Emmett Till for allegedly flirting with a white cashier. Allegedly, because he wasn't. Pictures of Till's mutilated body, and this was supported by the family. His mother wanted these published to really show what happened. And so this was an open casket funeral, and the images went worldwide, really showing what they're doing to our boys. Despite the evidence, the men were acquitted of all charges. Thousands around the world protested Till's death and this horrible court decision. 1 year later, the two men publicly admitted, yeah, we did it, when they sold their story to a national magazine. Because they'd already been tried and acquitted, they could no longer be convicted of the murder. There's no double jeopardy. You can't be tried twice for the same crime. African Americans, and even the woman that said they flirted with him, she also admitted that no, and she didn't really admit that until just the last couple of years. African Americans throughout America witnessed the injustice of this highly publicized murder and trial, and the event really unified the movement, and it creates a major shift. I'll stop there.